All right, pushing on, we go to Amendment B, the repeal of the property tax assessment rates. And this is a virtual discussion. Speaking in favor of Amendment B, we have Bernie Busher, and against Lindsey Singer. Do we have our participants available?
Yes.
Okay.
And this is Bernie Busher. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
I don't know that my video has been started.
There we are.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll begin with Mr. Busher with opening remarks, 90 seconds.
Thank you. I think we had a request that I would spend a few seconds describing what Gallagher is before doing my opening remarks. Is that still the plan?
No.
No. Okay. Then I'll just start. Thank you to the Post and Glenwood Springs for putting this on. I suspect all over the county people are turning off the presidential debates to watch this discussion about Gallagher, and I appreciate that. I would say to the Glenwood Springs Resort Chamber that you're in good company when you endorse the repeal of Gallagher and the adoption of Referendum B. Chambers all over the state have done that. I'm down in Grand Junction, the Grand Junction Chamber, Club 20, Denver Chamber, Colorado Springs Chamber. Chambers have consistently supported the repeal. I think you also understand how the Gallagher Amendment has systematically transferred property taxes to businesses and how it's damaging, especially now when COVID is making it difficult for businesses to reopen. It's challenging for small businesses and family farms. And of course, that's why the repeal has been endorsed by the National Federation of Independent Businesses, the Farm Bureau, and the Cattlemen's Association. Gallagher has been devastating to rural Colorado and our rural districts. And of course, that's why it's been endorsed by the Special Districts Association, the fire chiefs, the firefighters, and the rural fire districts. It's also damaging education. And that's happening just when education, because of COVID, is facing the toughest challenges in a very long time. And of course, that's why REF-B has been endorsed by the Colorado Education Association, the Colorado Association of School Boards, and countless school boards all over the state. Thank you.
Speaking against Amendment B, Lindsey Singer, 90 seconds.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I know our against person switched a couple times, so I appreciate you having me speak here. So the overarching theme of our opposition to Amendment B is really that there are issues with the Gallagher Amendment, but Amendment B is not the right solution. So there's three main things I want to talk about. First of all, if the Gallagher Amendment is repealed, we'll all be paying more in property taxes. Second, Amendment B doesn't do anything to help businesses. The assessment rate will freeze at 29%. We think that there should be a lower assessment rate for businesses. You know, we're about middle of the country right now when it comes to the business property tax rate. We think that should be higher and that our rating should be higher. The assessment rate should be lower. Amendment B doesn't address this at all. And lastly, the legislature didn't put forward a plan for what comes next. So Amendment B creates a lot of uncertainty, which I think is a really big issue for homeowners and for businesses. I want to be sure to touch on the issues that the Gallagher Amendment creates for some rural areas where housing prices may not be going up as quickly as on the Front Range, or there's not as much commercial services. These are big problems. They're not new problems. The legislature did a study where they came up with one of the solutions to this could be a regional approach, and that's what we're advocating for.
All right. Lindsey, we'll start with you with the first question. Gallagher is a statewide calculation, but its impact is more acute in rural communities, which are more often residential. How do you justify the unequal impact on urban and rural communities, and how would Amendment B solve or worsen this situation?
So I'm not here to justify that. I think, like I said, the impacts that it has on some communities where they have to cut services are unacceptable. We, as an organization, Colorado Rising Action is our organization, we've been advocating for a new regional approach to Gallagher for a while. And the legislature, you know, I can't imagine anyone in the legislature not thinking there's issues with Gallagher, but the way to fix them is by a regional approach that actually does help businesses, and that would give different regulations to rural areas that give them more support without repealing what is a constitutional protection on homeowners and renters, and at least helps stop slows the growth of our property taxes. So I think there needs to be a different solution that's regional and does address those issues.
Mr. Busher.
Thank you. A regional approach has been bandied about. I think Senator Bob Rankin has talked about that. Bob and I have spent hours discussing it, but ultimately, I think everyone who has looked at this in depth realizes that it's a bureaucratic nightmare. Look, we've got the Colorado River Water Conservation District. You heard a presentation earlier this afternoon about that. That covers 22 counties. Do you break that up and have different assessment rates in different parts of the district? We've got 3,800 districts in this state. How do you craft a proposal that takes into account that? Do you put Rifle and Aspen in the same district? Do you put Vale, Steamboat, and Craig in the same district? The issue is more complex than that. This regional approach is a simplistic idea, but it is bureaucratic nightmare.
Lindsey, your rebuttal.
Well, I don't think it's simplistic at all. I think it's really complicated, which is why they haven't done it yet. But that doesn't mean that Amendment B is a good solution for Coloradans. It'll be a $500 million tax increase, and then after the freeze, it's unknown. They basically said the Boulder Daily Camera actually compared it to cutting the plumbing pipes without having the equipment to replace them. And I just think, especially now, if we're thinking about the individual, you know, the property taxes go up, or property values go up, they're paying more in property taxes. And it's just going to affect the people who are the closest to losing their homes right now, are going to have to pay more in property taxes. And I think that we need to think about those people too when we're talking about the Gallagher amendment. I agree there's issues. Amendment B, I don't think is the right solution, especially without a plan for what comes next.
Mr. Busher, you get the next question. K through 12 funding is the largest part of the state's budget today because of the Gallagher amendment. Local funding makes up less than 40% of all K through 12 spending. If Amendment B passes, revenues to public schools would increase, which could allow the state to fund other priorities for transportation, higher education, and so forth. How should voters interpret this? Is Gallagher good or bad for local schools?
Every school district that I know of has endorsed the repeal of Gallagher. They've seen the way in which the local property tax base has eroded and their tax base has gone away. You're absolutely correct. 38 years ago, approximately 35% of education funding was by the state. Now it's close to 70%. The state's budget is in its own crisis, and the likelihood that the state will be able to backfill the decrease in local funding, as an old budget member, I would say it's really unlikely. And the damages to our K-12 system would be enormous. And at the same time, it puts pressure on the state budget, which damages higher ed funding, any possibility of funding for transportation, and all those things that we hold dear in Western Colorado. Thank you.
Lindsey, your response.
So I do think it's a problem that the state portion of education funding has increase so much. And the legislature can do things now, and I think they should in the next session, to change the education funding formula so that they're not backfilling some school districts that do have the tax base, and that they're able to help other school districts. It'll free up some space in that education funding. So I think that's something the legislature can do right away to address this. And I hope they do. I hope they start to make some other changes that do bring down business rates and help businesses, at the same time not harming the people who have to pay their mortgage and their rent.
Mr. Busher, your rebuttal.
Well, I think the comment is very telling. Because of the decrease in local funding, the state has backfilled. If the state chooses not to backfill and increases the negative factor, what does that mean? That means less funding for our schools. Before COVID, we had a number of school districts in Western and rural Colorado that were on 4-day school weeks. And I don't want to be alarmist, but you can't push that much further and provide our kids with the education that we want them to have. I'll just stop there.
All right. Next question for Lindsey. What about the argument that Gallagher was crafted by Front Range lawmakers with little regard to rural Colorado? Wouldn't a repeal be good for smaller communities?
So again, I'm not arguing that there aren't issues with Gallagher. The way it was created, so at the time it was created was before Tabor, and the interaction between Gallagher and Tabor created unforeseen issues. But I think that its purpose was to help taxpayers avoid skyrocketing taxes. And I want to just be clear about the numbers. I mean, we're paying more in property taxes every year. It's just helps to slow that growth. So Gallagher has been successful in helping to protect homeowners, help keep rents affordable. I think that's a good thing to encourage home ownership, and to provide some assistance to keep rents affordable. So yeah, I'll just stop there.
Your response, Mr. Busher?
I'm delighted that the opponent admits that the damage to rural Colorado has been real. The fact is, if Amendment B is successful and Gallagher is repealed, we freeze Colorado's property taxes for residents at the third lowest in the country. They would like us to do more, but the practical answer is we've got this thing called the single subject rule in Colorado. You can't do multiple things in the same proposition. So Gallagher is an important step. It's the right step. Should other things be done? I agree. Some other things would be good to do, but this is what can be done in a single subject matter right now. And I think that's why most people are supporting it.
Lindsey, any response to that?
Well, when he says most people, I mean, I've seen some polling that suggests that it's really not most people. I mean, we'll see what the voters actually have to say about this. But I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the point I wanted to make, but so I'll just move on.
All right, we'll go to the last question. Mr. Busher, Gallagher has shifted the burden of property taxes to businesses, mostly small businesses. So why is Amendment B good for business? In contrast, why would Amendment B bad for businesses?
Yeah, that's a sophisticated question. And what has happened as the residential assessment rate has ratcheted down and the all other rate has maintained the same, districts, whether they're school districts or special districts, have gone back to the voters time and again asking for mill levy increases. We've seen that over the 38 years. In fact, some districts now have de-Gallagherized and have automatic increases when the assessment rate ratchets down. The result of that has been that businesses now pay 4 times what residences do on the same $100,000 of property. If the next round of cuts happens, they'll pay 5 times. And as each mill levy increase occurs, more and more of that burden happens to businesses. So we've got to stop the bleeding. We've got to stop the transfer to small businesses. That's what referendum B does.
Lindsay, same question.
Yeah, so I think one of the points I made at the very beginning is that this doesn't actually help businesses. I would love to see the 29% business rate come down by a couple points. But the fact is that this freezes the business rate at 29% for, I can't remember the exact number of years, but then there's absolutely no plan. We don't know what comes next. And actually decoupling the business rate from the residential rate would make it easier for someone to bring a ballot initiative that actually increases the business rate again, and it would have a lower threshold. It would have only a 50% threshold. So what not having a plan means is it's one of the biggest issues with this. And I've admitted from the very beginning, I started off saying there's issues with Gallagher, there's issues with the way that it affects rural Colorado, but Amendment B isn't the right thing to fix that. And by not having a plan that comes next, the uncertainty that it creates, I think in itself should deserve a no vote.
Mr. Busher, rebuttal.
Sure. The rates would be frozen unless the legislature lowers either of those rates. Because of Tabor, the legislature cannot increase the commercial rate or the residential rate, but it does have the ability to lower them. Ultimately, and I'm speaking for myself here, I believe in representative government, and giving the legislature the ability to deal with this, to craft a budget as appropriate for the state, I think is good policy. And putting formulas into the Constitution, we've seen just doesn't work.
We move on to closing remarks. Lindsay, 90 seconds.
Yeah, so I just want to be clear about some of the numbers we're talking about. Even with the Gallagher amendment in place, we're paying almost double the amount of property taxes that we were when it was put in place. The Colorado Sun recently put out a study on that. And in the last 5 years, we're paying 53% more in property taxes in most of the states. So, sorry, in that statewide. So even during a recession, we're going to see these rates go up. I think the people who can least afford to see their rents go up will be the most harmed by repealing the Gallagher amendment. And one of the biggest problems is they're asking us to do it without having any idea about what would come next. There are, there could be situations where the legislature creates a vacuum for lobbyists and corporations to fill that vacuum. So I agree that the Gallagher amendment does need to change. There are issues. I don't think that increasing the property taxes on all Coloradans, including people who pay rent, it'll be passed down to them as well. And we have a bipartisan coalition on the no side as well. Dickie Lee Hollinghorst is the former Democrat Speaker of the House. She's with us mainly because of the consequences that it'll create for people who are struggling to afford their rent or mortgage payments now. So please vote no.
Mr. Busher, your closing remarks.
Thank you. Again, I want to thank the Glenwood Springs Chamber for their endorsement. When Gallagher was passed, I don't think anyone expected the insidious results that have occurred over the last 38 years. Colorado's changed. Gallagher is wreaking havoc on small businesses, on family farms, on providers of essential services like fire districts, the Colorado Water Conservation District, ambulance district, soil conservation districts, a concept that folks in Denver scarcely understand. Passing referendum B freezes Colorado's property tax rate at the 3rd lowest in the country. Those rates can only be increased by a vote of the citizens. One of the things that's really important for me is if referendum B fails, the pressure on the state's budget will be such that I'm confident the legislature will not be able to fund the seniors property tax homestead exemption. That's the biggest relief that we have for seniors and prevents them from being kicked out of their homes. So in spite of the argument that you just heard from the opponents, this protects those folks in their homes. That's why folks as disparate as Ken Salazar, Hank Brown, Wellington Red, Russell George, all support this repeal. 79 of the 100 members of our state legislature referred this to the voters. Please vote in favor of referendum B. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Busher and Lindsey Singer. Appreciate your time.